I never imagined my life could unravel so quickly. One moment, I was a devoted wife preparing dinner, and the next, I stood frozen in the laundry room, my husband's voice echoing down the hall, while another man's touch still lingered on my skin. My heart raced as the door swung open, and in that instant, I knew my secret was about to be exposed. I always believed I had the perfect marriage. My husband, Mark, was successful, dependable, and charming. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. We lived in a beautiful suburban home, the kind neighbors admired and envied. But inside those walls, something had been missing for years. Mark's job consumed him. Late nights at the office turned into weekends away, and soon, our conversations were reduced to reminders about bills and grocery lists. I tried to ignore the growing emptiness, convincing myself it was normal for passion to fade after 10 years of marriage. But deep down, I was lonely, aching for something more. I spent most days alone, tidying up the house, scrolling through social media, and pretending to stay busy. I joined yoga classes, took up gardening, and even tried writing, but nothing filled the void. I craved connection, attention, and excitement. Then came Tyler. He wasn't supposed to be anything more than the landscaper Mark hired to fix up our overgrown backyard. Young, confident, and effortlessly charming, Tyler had a smile that could light up the darkest room. At first, I barely noticed him, just another worker helping with the yard. But something about the way he looked at me, so direct and unguarded, stirred something inside I hadn't felt in years. It started innocently. A compliment about the flowers I'd planted. A laugh shared over a clumsy spill. But as the days passed, I began lingering outside while he worked, finding excuses to talk. I told myself it was harmless, that there was nothing wrong with enjoying a little attention. But I knew better. Mark's absence only made things worse. He'd come home exhausted, barely glancing at me before heading to bed. Meanwhile, Tyler's presence grew stronger, his gaze lingering just a second too long, his words dripping with something I hadn't heard in years, desire. I didn't want to admit it, but the excitement I felt every time I saw him terrified me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I was walking a dangerous line, and once I crossed it, there would be no going back. The days blurred into each other, but Tyler became the one constant I looked forward to. Every morning, I waited for the sound of his truck pulling up, pretending I just happened to be outside watering plants or rearranging patio furniture. He always noticed me. "Good morning, Mrs. Daniels," he'd say, his voice smooth and warm, sending a tingle down my spine. I told him to call me Rachel instead, and the way he said my name made my cheeks flush. But the guilt started creeping in. Mark barely noticed the change in me, how I started wearing makeup again, fixing my hair, or suddenly caring about what I wore, even if I had nowhere to go. He didn't question why I spent more time outside, or why I seemed distracted during dinner. Maybe he was too wrapped up in work, or maybe he'd already stopped caring. I wanted to believe I was still in control, that nothing would happen, but the tension between Tyler and me was impossible to ignore. Every accidental brush of his hand, every lingering look felt like a spark igniting something forbidden. One afternoon, Mark came home early, catching me completely off guard. I was in the garden, laughing at something Tyler had said, my hand resting lightly on his arm. Mark's voice broke the moment. "What's so funny?" I spun around, my heart pounding. "Oh, nothing." Tyler was just explaining how to keep the roses from wilting. Mark barely glanced at him before heading inside, but his sudden appearance left me rattled. I couldn't shake the feeling that he suspected something. That night, Mark seemed distant, more than usual. He sat across from me at the dinner table, scrolling through his phone without a word. I kept waiting for him to bring it up, to ask questions, but he didn't. Instead, the silence stretched between us, heavier than ever. I tried to convince myself that Mark's lack of suspicion meant everything was fine, but my nerves told a different story. I became hyper-aware of my actions, of how often I checked my reflection before stepping outside, of how my eyes lingered on Tyler's arms as he worked. I even started avoiding Mark's gaze, afraid he might see the guilt written all over my face. But no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I couldn't stay away. The more Mark withdrew, the more I craved Tyler's attention. And with every stolen glance and subtle smile, I felt myself slipping further and further down a path I knew I couldn't return from. It was a warm afternoon when the line finally blurred. Tyler was trimming the hedges while I pretended to sweep the patio, stealing glances at him as he worked. His shirt clung to his body, soaked with sweat, highlighting every muscle as he moved. I told myself it was just harmless admiration, but my pulse quickened every time he looked up and caught me staring. "You're working too hard," I said, stepping closer and offering him a glass of lemonade. He took it, his fingers brushing mine. "Thanks, Rachel. You didn't have to do this." His eyes lingered, and for a moment the world seemed to slow. I tried to laugh off the tension. "It's just lemonade, Tyler." But the way he looked at me told me it wasn't just lemonade. It was more. Days passed, and the excuses to be near him grew bolder. I asked him to fix a loose patio chair, then a broken light fixture inside the house. I caught myself watching him move through my home like he belonged there, like he belonged to me. One day, as he stood on a ladder changing a bulb, I couldn't help but stare at the curve of his arms and the slight stretch of his shirt. He looked down and caught my gaze. "Need something?" he teased, his lips curling into a grin. I shook my head, stepping back. "No, just thank you for doing this." He climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag. "Anytime." But he didn't step away. Instead, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You're beautiful, Rachel," he said softly. My breath hitched. "You shouldn't say that." "Why not?" His voice dropped. "You deserve to hear it." I should have stepped back. I should have ended it right there. But instead, I leaned in, just enough for him to know I didn't want him to stop. And he didn't. The first kiss felt like fire. My head screamed that it was wrong, but my body refused to listen. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. Over the next few days, the tension turned into something undeniable. I waited for the moments Mark was at work or distracted in his home office, just to be alone with Tyler. Every touch, every whispered word made me forget about the life I was risking. But the guilt never left. One afternoon, Tyler pulled me aside after finishing his work. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I wanted to say no, that I wasn't sure, that it was all a mistake, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I cupped his face and kissed him again. The thrill of sneaking around, of stolen moments and hidden glances, consumed me. It was like I had woken up from a sleep I didn't realize I was in. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last. One night, as Tyler and I stood too close in the dimly lit hallway, I heard Mark's car pull into the driveway. "Go," I whispered, shoving him toward the back door. He left just in time, but the fear of getting caught lingered. And yet, even as I lay next to Mark in bed that night, his back turned to me, I couldn't stop thinking about Tyler. I wanted him, and that terrified me. The night it all fell apart started like any other. Mark had called earlier to let me know he'd be working late. "Another spreadsheet emergency," he said. I barely listened, too distracted by the way Tyler's hand lingered on mine when I handed him a glass of water earlier that day. By the time Tyler finished cleaning up the yard, the sun had set, leaving a dim glow through the windows. I stood by the counter, pretending to sort mail while he packed up his tools. "You're quiet tonight," he said, leaning against the doorframe. I looked up, my pulse quickening at the way his gaze locked onto mine. "Just tired. You sure that's all it is?" I hesitated. That was the moment I should have walked away, ended whatever this was before it was too late. But instead, I stepped closer, letting the heat of his presence overwhelm the guilt gnawing at me. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, brushing his fingers along my jaw. "I do," he said, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. It was reckless, desperate, and intoxicating all at once. But then, the sound of the front door slamming shut. "Rachel!" Mark's voice echoed through the house. I shoved Tyler away, my heart hammering in my chest. "You need to go now." But it was too late. Mark stepped into the kitchen, his eyes landing on Tyler first, then me. His brow furrowed, confusion giving way to something darker as he took in the way we stood too close. The tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. "What's going on here?" Mark's voice was sharp, demanding answers. Tyler stepped back, but Mark's gaze stayed locked on me. "Rachel." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My silence was louder than any confession. Mark's face twisted in disbelief as realization dawned. "You've got to be kidding me." "It's not what it looks like," I finally managed, but the lie felt hollow even as I said it. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Not what it looks like. Are you serious? How long has this been going on?" I froze, unable to answer. "That's what I thought," he said coldly before turning to Tyler. "Get out of my house. Now." Tyler hesitated, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment before nodding and walking out without another word. The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with Mark, and the storm brewing in his eyes. "How could you?" His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw the pain behind his anger. Tears welled up, but I knew no apology would be enough. "I'm sorry, Mark." Sorry," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Rachel. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that you betrayed me in our own home." I wanted to explain, to make him understand how lonely I had felt, how invisible he had made me. But the words died in my throat because deep down, I knew nothing could justify what I'd done. Mark paced the kitchen, running a hand through his hair. "I trusted you. I thought we were just going through a rough patch. But this is unforgivable." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I never meant for this to happen," I whispered. "But it did," he snapped. "And now I can't even look at you without seeing him." I broke down, sobbing as Mark walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the crushing realization that everything we had built was falling apart. The next morning, Mark packed a bag and left. I called him, texted him, begged him to come home so we could talk, but he ignored me. The silence was deafening. And Tyler? He was gone too. He stopped answering my calls, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. Days turned into weeks, and the house felt emptier than ever. Every corner reminded me of what I'd lost, of the choices I'd made that couldn't be undone. Mark finally came back, but only to gather more of his things. He wouldn't even look at me as he moved through the house, and when I tried to touch him, he recoiled like my touch burned him. "It's over, Rachel," he said before walking out for the last time. And just like that, my life fell apart. The silence after Mark left was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock echoed through the emptiness of the house we had built together. It was no longer a home, just a collection of walls closing in on me. I spent the first few days in denial, replaying every moment, every decision that had led to this disaster. I told myself Mark just needed time to cool down, that he'd come back and we'd figure it out. But deep down, I knew the damage was permanent. Mark didn't return my calls. When I texted him, all I got was a single-word response: "Don't." I tried reaching out to Tyler too, desperate for some sense of comfort, but he had vanished. No replies. No explanations. It was as if I had been erased from his life overnight. I was alone. The guilt was suffocating. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The nights felt the worst. I'd lie awake in the empty bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I let things spiral so far out of control. I thought about the first time Mark and I met, how he'd made me laugh so hard that I cried, how he'd proposed under the stars because he knew how much I loved the night sky. Those memories haunted me now, taunting me with glimpses of the happiness I had destroyed. I started blaming myself for everything. If only I'd talked to Mark sooner, if only I'd fought harder to fix our marriage instead of seeking validation from someone else. But it was too late for regrets. The divorce papers came a few weeks later. Mark didn't even hand them to me himself, he had a lawyer send them. Seeing his signature on those documents made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. I broke down in the kitchen, clutching the papers like they were some kind of lifeline. But they weren't. They were the end. When I finally signed them, it felt like closing the door on the last 10 years of my life. The days dragged on, but the world didn't stop. Bills still needed to be paid. The house still needed to be cleaned. I went through the motions, but I felt hollow, like a ghost drifting through my own life. Friends I thought would be there for me started pulling away. Some were loyal to Mark, while others just didn't know what to say. I could see the judgment in their eyes, even when they tried to hide it. One afternoon, I bumped into Mark at the grocery store. He looked different, tired but lighter, as if letting go of me had freed him. I wanted to say something, to beg for another chance, but the way he looked past me, like I was a stranger, stole the words from my lips. I left the store and cried in my car for what felt like hours. But eventually the tears dried. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of everything. She told me I wasn't a monster, that people make mistakes, and that healing would take time. I wanted to believe her, but some days were harder than others. I deleted Tyler's number, finally admitting to myself that whatever we had wasn't love. It was an escape. And escapes don't last. I stopped waiting for Mark to come back. I stopped replaying old memories and torturing myself with what-ifs. Instead, I focused on moving forward, slowly, painfully, but forward nonetheless. I sold the house. I couldn't bear to stay in a place that reminded me of what I'd lost. Packing up the photos and memories felt like tearing pieces of myself away, but it was necessary. As I stood in the empty living room for the last time, I allowed myself one final breakdown, one last release of everything I'd been holding in. Then I closed the door and walked away. Moving out of the house felt like the end of a chapter one never expected to write. The emptiness I carried wasn't just about losing Mark. It was about losing myself somewhere along the way. The days that followed were quieter, but not easier. I spent hours staring at my phone, fighting the urge to message Mark, to apologize again, even though I knew the damage was too deep to repair. Therapy became my lifeline. My therapist pushed me to confront the choices I'd made, and the reasons behind them. It wasn't just about Mark's absence or Tyler's attention. It was about the cracks in me that I had ignored for too long. I had let loneliness and insecurity fester, convincing myself that validation from someone else could fix what was broken inside me. But all it did was shatter what little I had left. The hardest part was facing the truth. I had betrayed not just Mark but myself. For weeks, I avoided mirrors because I couldn't stand to look at the woman staring back at me. The woman who had traded loyalty for passion, trust for temptation. But one day I stopped avoiding. I looked at my reflection and saw someone who had made mistakes, terrible, irreversible mistakes, but who was still standing. And I decided that had to count for something. I stopped living in the past. I stopped replaying what I should have done differently and started focusing on what I could do now. I enrolled in a writing class, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the courage to pursue. I poured my emotions into words, turning my guilt and regret into stories that helped me heal. And I learned to be alone without feeling lonely. I still think about Mark. I wonder if he's happier without me, if he's found someone who treats him the way he deserves. Part of me hopes he has. He didn't deserve the pain I caused him. But I also know that what happened taught me lessons I'll never forget. I learned that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. That one moment of weakness can destroy years of love and commitment. And most of all, I learned that no amount of passion is worth the guilt that comes after. As painful as it was, losing Mark forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. I still carry the scars, but they remind me to be better, to never let loneliness or insecurity drive me to make decisions I'll regret. If I could go back, I'd do everything differently. But since I can't, all I can do now is move forward and hope my story serves as a warning for others. Because the truth is, no affair is ever worth losing the people who truly love you. What would you have done in my situation? Was it loneliness that pushed me over the edge, or was I just looking for an excuse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that dive into the raw, messy truths about love, betrayal, and second chances, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You won't believe what's coming next.